everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we would like to speak about the transition from Counter 5 to Counter 5.1. I would like to thank once again and welcome Tasha Mellins-Cohen. I think everybody knows Tasha, and who doesn't probably started working in the librarian world like yesterday. So, yeah, Tasha is the superstar of countermetrics, and therefore she is the best person to tell us something about what is new in Counter 5.1 and how to make sure that we can transition correctly. So, Tasha, I'll give you the word.
Thank you, Simona. So yes, hi everybody. I am, for my sins, the Executive Director at Countermetrics, which also means I do membership engagement, I do education, I do training, I do tech support, and all of the other things. I do have the wonderful Sean Harris helping me one day a week. But if you've ever sent an email and wondered why it's taken me a few days to get to it, it's because it's just me. So I have been asked to talk to you about the transition from release 5 to release 5.1, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background as well, but only a very little bit. So let's see if I can share the right thing and not the interview transcripts that I was looking at earlier. Counter is a community standard for usage metrics that's been around since 2003. And the reason that libraries and publishers came together all those years ago to develop a community standard is that they wanted something that would allow consistent, comparable usage metrics across different publisher platforms and over time. Unlike web analytics, everything that we do is open, so you can see what the code is, by which I mean the code of practice, but also things like our JSON schema and our counter API are openly available. Our education materials are openly available. You can see what we're doing, when and why, which is not the case with web analytics and other commercial products. The other thing that our libraries were very, very keen to ensure is that Counter is privacy protective by design. You will never see user information in a Counter report. The most granular we ever go is for a single month for an entire institution's usage. So whereas something like Google Analytics will tell you about the individuals who are using materials, Counter reports will only ever show you aggregated usage information. And because libraries and publishers all had a hand in creating Counter, and because it is consistent and open and privacy protective, we are trusted by literally hundreds of publishers and thousands of libraries around the world. One of the things that gets thrown at me every so often is that Counter changes all the time. And actually, I looked back at our frequency of releases when we were starting to work on release 5.1, and on average, we put out a significant change every 5 years. The reason that it might feel more frequent than that is because it takes us at least 3 years to develop, consult, and then release an update to the code of practice and have it implemented by publishers. So I was part of I started volunteering for Counter in 2015 when we'd already started thinking about a potential release 5. We published it 2 years later and it came into force in 2019. And by 2021, we were already thinking about a 5.1. It took 2 years for us to publish it and another 18 months for it to come into force in January of this year. We're already looking at extensions and best practice guidelines, and I'll touch on those briefly in a moment. What I'm going to cover is the basics of 5.1. If you are unsure about Counter in any way, there is an absolute mass of free educational material on our website, countermetrics.org/education. That will give you access to the 8 different friendly guides. They're available not just in English, but also French, German, simplified Mandarin, Japanese, and Spanish. I'm speaking with people about introducing versions in Hindi as well, and also Polish. And if there's any other languages you want and you are willing to work with me to get those out the door, please do shout. We love getting out translations. So, migrating to release 5.1. I'm tackling this as a bit of a myth buster. So I'm going to start with change control. We didn't just wake up one morning and decide that we were going to make problems for libraries, I promise. Doing a breaking release of the code of practice is an awful lot of work. We started gathering feedback from the community, libraries and publishers and consortia and aggregators and technology providers all the way back in 2019 when Release 5 hit live implementation. And in September 2021, the technical team reviewed all of those ideas and those pieces of feedback that we'd gathered to work out which of those were technically feasible. It took a couple of months for us to complete that, but in December 2021, the executive committee sort of agreed the broad outline of what would go into Release 5.1. It then took us 6 more months to get out for public consultation. That stayed open for, I think, 3.5 months, and we had more feedback on the Release 5.1 consultation than on any previous release of the Code of Practice. We took all of that into consideration and spent the period between, I think, October 2022 and April 23 revising and updating the code so that it could be published in May 2023. And then, as I've said, there was an 18-month implementation period before compliance in January of this year. And at that point, first myth, publishers are given 28 days to process usage metrics into counter-compliant metrics and formats. So that means when we required implementation in January of 2025, those are the January reports, which did not need to be delivered until the 28th of February. So I've had some libraries question why we implemented in February. We didn't. It was just that was the first time that reports became available for January 2025. There was quite a lot that we left unchanged. We didn't touch the 4 counter reports, and apologies to anyone who's already heard me rant repeatedly about why standard views are something I would like to get rid of. There are 4 counter reports. Yes, many of them, all of them have a variety of standard views. I always recommend using the reports because they are more comprehensive and more useful. I know CELUS harvests the reports with all of their attributes by default, so well done, CELUS. We also didn't change the metrics themselves. We still have the same suite of usage metrics. That's the total and unique item investigations, the total and unique item requests, and the unique title investigations and unique title requests. Those are completely unchanged, as are the search and denial metrics. So I'm not going to go through those. We also took the opportunity of a release to fix some interesting typographic errors and make some clarifications where things were unclear. But we did have to make some changes, and I'm going to run you through the 5 changes that we made in this order. The first one is item as the unit of reporting, and this pretty much only affects books. And there is a myth that goes around occasionally that this move to item being the unit of reporting will inflate book metrics, and that isn't true. The unique title investigations and unique title requests, so the book level metrics, are completely unchanged. They are exactly the same in 5.1 as they were in 5. What has changed is that books no longer get special treatment. So under the terms of Release 5, if a book was available chapter by chapter and as a full text download, a user could go to the platform and choose to download each chapter as a PDF, and they would get a unique item request for each chapter rolled up to a single unique title request. Or they could go to the same platform and request the whole book as a PDF, and that would only show as one unique item request. Still only one unique title request. That means that we had publishers who were having to count the same usage in 2 different ways, which was a really, well, logically inconsistent, but also a source of error. it was also completely different from the way everything else was handled. So if somebody went in and downloaded 10 PDFs from a special issue of a journal as a single file, each of the articles within that file would be counted as a separate item. So why were we treating books as this weird thing where a book could be its own single count? So we have removed that oddity, and books are now counted exactly the same way as everything else. So that was a really big change. And I know some libraries are seeing much higher item level usage for books as a result of that. It is completely to be expected, but if you look at your title level metrics, those are unchanged, and you can compare easily what the usage is at book level from 5 to 5.1. I'm aware of time, so I'm skipping through this quite quickly. The other thing that we did was, and I can see Beda flinching, we had long discussions about access types. So we had controlled, which everybody knows, subscription content, and we had OA Gold, which fairly specifically referred to APC-funded open access. We decided that it is not Counter's place to try and define what type of open access is actually open. We don't really have a way of assessing the license type that something is published under or the business model that something is published under. So OA Gold became open, which we figured was just easier. We also allowed publishers to start using the free to read access type. And this is something that was previously restricted for use by repositories only. And free to read would be, for example, as you can see on the screen, something like a situation where archive content, so prior years of publication, are made openly available by the publisher under so-called bronze OA. We had a situation where all this stuff was freely available, and libraries knew this stuff was freely available, and then they would just exclude prior years of publication from their counter reporting because they didn't want to inflate the usage metrics associated with the stuff that they were paying for and get an artificially low cost per download. So we were hoping that with the inclusion of the new free to read access type, libraries would be willing to download that full data. They would be willing to actually access the comprehensive set of counter metrics for each publisher, including the free to read material, without having to do any kind of peculiar data manipulation to restrict their cost per use calculations to controlled content. One of the myths that came up that really surprised me was the idea that publishers were going to close their archives so that they wouldn't have to apply free to read and show libraries how much content they were getting for free. Having consulted widely with the libraries that are part of our various committees, libraries were very well aware of what they were getting for free beforehand. And publishers are replying that actually, no, they're closing their archives because they don't want them to be scraped by AI learning modules. So that was a fun conversation at the beginning of the year about with people who were upset that publisher archives were closing off. It's not Counter, it is actually AI. It's quite reassuring for me. The next thing we touched was data types, and this was partly to reflect increasing content diversity. So, for example, being able to specify that conferences, for example, are not the same as books or journals and shouldn't be artificially kludged into being a book or a journal. But also to clarify how data types like article link to parent data types like journal. And there's a whole news piece on our website from a couple of weeks ago that goes into those sort of aggregated data type and parent data type relationships. And then we got into the technical pieces, and I'm sure Beda can wax lyrical far more than I can about the problems that we had with IP authentication for the counter API, which used to be known as SUSHI. But that is no longer option. It's no longer an option because it created so many problems. Um, Publishers can use API key authentication as a replacement for security if they want to, but it's not mandatory. And we also updated the endpoints so that you can, for example, always see the status endpoint and check whether a specific counter API service is active or not. I think we also extended the reports endpoint to show information about the first and last months for which data are available. On the JSON side, so JSON is the much more machine readable version of the counter reports, not the tabular version that I usually use for demos. We aim to become OpenAPI 3.1 compliant, which makes our JSON much easier to work with. The schema is just more compact. It's easier to read, easier to use, and critically, from my perspective, it's easier to validate using our free counter validator tool. So that was helpful. And we also found that we had some random duplicate fields or extra fields that only appeared in the JSON and didn't appear in the tabular version. So we got rid of those peculiar oddities. So I mentioned at the beginning, we have half of me and 1 day a week of Sian Harris. So clearly, as much as I love our fantastic volunteers, there are less than 40 volunteers and not even a full-time member of staff for Counter. We're not perfect. I would say our impact is way out of scale with our size, but we do want to do more and we do want to get better. So there are 3 community consultations coming up. One went live actually yesterday, and that's Pathways to Compliance. And the idea behind that is to find ways to help small publishers get from no counter reporting at all, making incremental steps that will help libraries, but that will not be so technically complex that the publishers can't make that jump. So easier ways to get small publishers on board. There is a complicated one about how we deal with situations where a single user can be tied to multiple institutional identities. So, for example, if you have a visiting professor that's signed in as belonging to the University of Sussex, which is just up the road from me, but is also sitting on campus at Harvard, which of those universities should get the usage reporting? And then, of course, the joy and delight that is generative and agentic AI. So Pathways went out to this week. Multiple identities is scheduled for next week, and we're hoping that AI will follow the week after. So please keep an eye out for those and do feedback and tell us what you think about these guidelines as they're coming. They're the most practical way we have of responding to changes in the industry and changes in the community without going through another breaking release and taking 4 years to do it. I'm going to hand over to Beda, but if anybody wants to get in touch with me, it's tasha@countermetrics.org. Just please be patient about my reply.
Thank you very much, Tasha. I will just jump here into it. We only have one question, so maybe it's going to be easier if I ask you now.
Sure.
Brady is asking, so book chapters and whole books are the same? I download 2 book chapters of a book and someone else downloads the entire book. The total count is 3.
So you would see, so if you download 2 chapters of the book and somebody else downloads the whole book, you will see 2 unique title requests. But from your session, you would get 2 unique item requests, one for each chapter. And for the other session, you would get a unique item request for every single chapter. So if there are 10 chapters in the book, you would get 10 unique item requests. Does that make sense? I can see Beda nodding, but I'd be really worried if it didn't make sense to Beda.
To me, it does make sense as well. And Brady says, yes, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you very much.
And Joe is asking if you can repeat it once more, please.
So you have 2 people, 1 book, 10 chapters in the book. Person number 1 downloads 2 chapters from the book. That results in 2 unique item requests, 1 for each chapter, and 1 unique title request for the book as a whole. Person number 2 downloads the whole book as an EPUB. That is 10 unique item requests, 1 for each chapter, but still only 1 unique title request.
Okay, so Joe, I hope this is clear now because the time is fast, and I would like to invite Beda, the lead developer of CELUS, or as we like to say, the brain and the heart behind CELUS, to show you how to deal with Counter 5 to Counter 5.1 transition within CELUS. Beda, it's yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. Maybe I see that there is one more question appeared in the Q&A, so I will maybe directly answer it. It is SUSHI getting away, or what is happening with SUSHI? Well, SUSHI is just a name that was used in Counter 5. Now it's called Counter API in Counter 5.1, but it's the same thing. So it really, SUSHI didn't disappear. It just renamed itself, or we renamed it. Okay, so now to my presentation. I will show you a live demo of CELUS and how to work with Counter 5 and Counter 5.1 data together. So how to manage the transition between the two seamlessly without having to worry about missing some data or etc. I hope you can see my screen, the shared screen with CELUS. I created 4 artificial platforms here, so that for this demonstration with strange names. And I also, for each of them, I harvested some data. I used our own, let's say, SUSHI server, which is randomly generating artificial data. So the data I will be showing now are completely artificial. There is nothing real about them. The platforms are artificial. It's just for the purpose of the demonstration. So you can see I have these 4 platforms. For one of them, I have only Counter 5 SUSHI enabled. For one of them, I have only 5.1, and for 2 of them, I have both versions. When I now go to the data coverage overview, I will show you how I populated the platforms with data. So for Counter, I will start with Counter 5 and the title report. And here you can see that I have 3 platforms. The last one is called Traditional Publishing. And this is a platform which only has Counter 5 and has the data since 2024 until now. It only publishes Counter 5. It didn't move to Counter 5.1. They are traditional. Then there is another platform which is called Responsible Platform. And this platform used to have Counter 5 in 2024. Then the first 3 months of 2025, they also had Counter 5, but at the beginning of 25, they switched to Counter 5.1, and they also provide Counter 5.1 since then. And then there is another platform which is called Progressive Press. This also had Counter 5 in 24, but then in 25, they started producing 5.1, but they also reprocessed all their usage for Counter 5.1 back into the 2024. So you can see that these 2 platforms don't have Counter 5 usage now. But if I then switch over to 5.1, you will see that the Progressive Press has the 5.1 for all time, even 2024, and the Responsible Platform has switched to 5.1 at the beginning of this year. And then there is another platform which I called New Kids on the Block. This is a new platform. They didn't exist last year. They just started this year. They only have 5.1. They never had 5. They are just using the newest version. So this is how the data is set up. And now how to deal with these different situations. Sometimes there is only one version of counter data. Sometimes I have like an overlap between the two, and I want to somehow handle this so that I don't get lost in the data, so that I can everything see clearly what the usage is. So now if I go to these platforms, I will select the details of the responsible platform because this is the one which switched to counter 5, and there were 3 months of overlap between counter 5 and counter 5.1. So if I now here in this chart switch to counter 5, you can see it here. They have usage until March of this year in counter 5, and then it dropped out and there is no data since then. If I switch to counter 5.1, I can see that since the beginning of this year, they started with 5.1, but they don't have any 5.1 data in the last year. So there is a 3 months overlap. And now, how do I deal with that? Well, in CELUS, one of the things that you can use and that we provide you is this is the synthetic report called interest. I think if you are a user of CELUS, you will know this because you can see it all the time in CELUS. And this is our way, how we are coping with putting together data from different versions of counter, and also how to mix non-counter data into that, so that you can always see some kind of usage. It should somehow express the real interest of the user. So we are selecting specific metrics from specific reports and using them for this interest report. And as I mentioned, the interest was purposely designed to manage the transition between counter versions. We introduced it when there was a transition between counter 4 to counter 5, and now we also use it from counter 5 to 5.1. The way it is organized can be seen here on this interest overview page, where you can see a very simplified overview of the hierarchy of the reports, how they are used. So for full text type of interest, we prefer counter 5.1. So we always prefer the newest version, and item report. So if you have the most granular data in the newest version, so counter 5.1 item report, we will use it. If you don't, then we will fall back to 5.1 title report. If you don't have it, we will fall back to counter 5 title report, and then to counter 4, these 3 different counter 4 reports if you have neither of those. So if you have data from 10 years ago, they are probably in counter 4 and they still work, you will still see them in this interest chart without problem. So using this, if I go back to this page where I was showing this counter 5, counter 5.1 data, now when I switch to interest, you can see that the data continues. It started in 2024, continues in 2025. There is a jump here in the data at the beginning of 2025. This is unfortunately because as you can see here, the randomly generated data for different counter versions have different scales. So this is an unfortunate artifact of how the data is generated. You can see here, these are tens of thousands, and for 5, it's just 1,000. So then in this interest, when you see it all together, you can see a jump here. This is where the interest computation transitioned from the counter 5 to counter 5.1 data. But the cool thing is that you can see all the usage in one chart without any breaks. If you want, of course, if this were real counter data, there would be no jump because there was almost no change how the usage is computed between counter 5 and counter 5.1 if we don't speak about books. So there shouldn't be any jump here. So you wouldn't really see the transition, but you can very clearly visualize it if you switch this chart here. And one of the charts which we have available here is the source report type in time. So you can switch to show which of the source reports were used for the computation. And you can clearly see here that until the end of 24, we have been using counter 5 reports, and since then we are using counter 5.1. So if you are using the standard like report interest, which we use all over CELUS for different purposes, you already have this continuity between counter 5 and counter 5.1 ensured because it's part of this interest computation. But of course, you may be interested in more detailed information, and you may be interested in really comparing the counter 5.1 usage together. And then the best way how to do it is to go into our reporting module and work with it from there. So here, the basic, the default report I can see here uses counter 5 title report, but I can also use two different reports. So I can mix it with the counter 5.1 title report. And now I will have data which combine the usage from both of those. So if I now run it, you will see rows will be platforms. There will be columns for different metrics, but I don't want that. I will use report types as columns, and I will add a filter to only use one metric so that we can see the data better, and there are not too many columns in there. So now if I run this report, you will see that I have the 4 platforms, and I have the usage split to counter 5 and counter 5.1 title reports. I am using data from start of 2024 until September. One of the interesting new features you can see here in the reporting is this coverage. You normally see it here. This is the overall coverage, how much data you have from the full coverage, where you would have all data for all the months for all the reports. It will be 100%. Now it's only 69, and here you can see it for each individual platform. So you can see that for traditional publishing, we have 100% coverage because they have just counter 5 and they have it for all the time. But for the rest, for instance, the progressive press, they have full coverage in counter 5.1, but in counter 5 they only have last year and not this year, so they don't have 100% coverage, they have just 79%. And you can see the usage for each of those reports. For these new kids on the block, they have no counter 5 usage because they didn't use it, and traditional publishing doesn't have any 5.1 because they just publish counter 5. But for the other, there is a different usage for each of the reports. Again, this is an artifact of how we created the data. In case of normal counter reports, the usage would be the same or nearly the same. So this is nice, but the problem here is that this number for the progressive press is for counter 5 is for last year, and for counter 5.1 it's for this year and last year together. So if you really sum up these numbers together, you would have some duplication of the numbers. And this, of course, is something that you don't want. So this is why we created in the newest version of CELUS, which was released just last week. We have this button which is called Merge Reports. And what it does is that instead of treating these two reports separately, it will instead mark one of them as the primary source, and the other one will be like a fallback. So it will combine these two reports together, and whenever for each platform, for each month, it looks into the database, and if there is the data for the primary data from the primary report, it will use that. If there is not, it will use the fallback report. So this way, you can fill in the gaps from one report with data from the other. What you can see immediately, if I click this button, if I check this checkbox, the coverage, which used to be 69, jumps to 85, And this is because now it's not treated as two separate reports, but it's one like aggregated report. And whenever you have data, it's counts as being covered by data. So only the real gaps, like in this new kids on the block, which didn't have data last year, this is the only gap that will be there. So if I do it like this, we will get usage from counter 5, and filled in will be counter 5.1 if there is no counter 5 usage. So if I run it, you will see that now the coverage has changed. In all the platforms, I have 100% coverage, except new kids on the block who don't have 2024 at all. And you will see that the usage here has changed. The usage from counter 5 is the same as before, but here, for instance, this counter 5.1 was 7 million. Now it's only 3 million because it only counts the data from 5.1 for the time where there was no data for counter 5. And here you can also see an indication of which report was used. So in this case, it was a mix of 5 and 5.1. Here it was just 5.1. They don't have anything else. The last, they also only have 5. And the first one and the third one, they also have there's also a mix. So this is how you can very easily combine the two together. And now I will just show you how to switch these in reverse order. So if I unselect counter 5 and select it again, then counter 5.1 will be the first one. I again do merge here. I need to select again report type here. And now if you look at these numbers, if I run it again, they will change. And here in Progressive Press, who has the complete coverage of the all time all this period with 5.1, they only have 5.1 data. They have 0 for counter 5. And you can see only counter 5.1 was used to produce this report. So this is very clearly changed. Now, to give you even like more detailed overview how it works, let's split this data by platform and put year and month into the rows. And let's say and keep report type in columns. If I run it now, I will order it here. You can see that new kids on the block, they just don't have this counter 5.1, nothing interesting here. Traditional publishing, they just have counter 5, nothing interesting here. But if I go to Progressive Press, it's not also that interesting right now because we are using counter 5.1 as the primary report. And because they have counter 5 for all the time, it's just counter 5, nothing else. Counter 5.1. But if I go to responsible platform, you can see that until the end of 24, there was only counter 5. So counter 5 was used. And since they started producing 5.1 data, you can see that we are using counter 5.1. So this is how it works. And regardless of how you create the report, every time it will just combine these two reports and give you the correct answer. Just out of curiosity, I will again switch the order of the reports. Now everything has switched off, so I will again do it like this. And you can see here the responsible platform, the data ends, counter 5 ends at the end of 2024, then starts counter 5.1. But if I run it like here now, you will see that now I preferred counter 5 and 5.9 was as fallback. And now even January till March this year was used from counter 5. Similar situation will be here in Progressive Press. Before they just have counter 5.1 because this was the primary and the data was there, but now we are interested in counter 5 as primary, so we are using as much counter 5 data as possible, and then we use counter 5.1 as fallback. So this is a new feature in CELUS where you can very easily combine Counter 5 and Counter 5.1 reports to create one overall report, which is really helpful because many platforms these days offer, they have transitioned during this year. And if you want to see the usage from last year and this year together and work with it, then this is the only way or the simplest way how to really do it. Of course, another way how you could have this kind of behavior here would be if you simply deleted the overlapping data. So if you had like Counter 5 for the first 3 months in this year, but Counter 5.1 for the whole year, then you could just delete the first 3 months of Counter 5 and ensure that there is no overlapping data. But this is really not necessary. Sometimes it's really interesting to have a way to compare this data. And now with the current version of CELUS, you really don't have to do that. You don't have to be afraid of having overlapping data. You can just use this new feature to merge these reports together and everything will work okay. Of course, as I mentioned before, Interest already has this feature built in. So whenever you see it, you know that there is no like double counting and it smoothly transitions from one version of Counter to the other. And whenever you need something more detailed than Interest, then you can just simply go to reporting and use it from there. So that's all from me. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them. If you have any questions later on, you think about something later on, or if you try this feature and find that something doesn't work as expected, or you don't understand what it's doing, then don't be afraid to send us an email at ask@celus.net, and we will be happy to answer any questions you have later on.
Thank you, Beda. That was fruitful, I would say. I saw some things that I have not seen before in CELUS, and I work for CELUS, so that's interesting. Now we have a couple of questions here. I will probably start with the one that I'm not sure how we will answer, but it has 5 upvotes. So Caleb is asking, how can those of us who aren't using CELUS manage the migration from 5 to 5.1?
I have only the obvious answer. Get CELUS, but I understand that it might not be the most helpful one.
I think I may be able to assist. So it somewhat depends on whether you are harvesting tabular versions of the reports or if you are pulling from the Counter API, what used to be known as SUSHI, into your, for example, Power BI or Tableau. What we are recommending for those who are using Power BI or similar systems is that you pull both sets of data for like a month or two that are overlapping and just compare and contrast and then make a decision about which one you want to treat as your primary, and then harvest your primary reports as far back as are available. For those libraries that are still using tabular reports, and I know that is a lot of libraries are still very much using their tabular reports, what I would suggest is that as soon as 5.1 becomes available, you grab those release 5.1 tabular reports and make it where you can for a whole year, whether that's a calendar year or your academic year, but you make that switch at the beginning of whichever year you need to make the switch. The challenge, of course, is that even with an 18-month implementation time, and even with lots of education and training and support from me and pressure from libraries, not all publishers have yet made the migration. So we are unfortunately still in a mixed model environment. I would say we're an awful lot way further through than we were when we did the release 4 to release 5 migration. We are well over 200 platforms have made the shift to release 5.1. And it's very easy to check. If you go to registry.countermetrics.org, you can always see who's offering 5.1 and which reports they have. Hopefully that's helpful, Caleb.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Tasha. We have one question here from Paul, which I believe is quite close to what we just said, and maybe there are slightly different answers from Beda and from Tasha to this. Paul is asking best practice, figure out when publisher makes change to 5.1 and delete any 5.0 that overlaps. So maybe Tasha, if you can answer from your point of view, what do you think is the best practice?
I mean, as I said, I would double check them. One of the things that we did see before the audit process really kicked in, because obviously implementation in January, some of the audits started in January, but that didn't necessarily mean that all the audits were wrapped up when publishers had made the migration. And we did see that when we compared release 5 with release 5.1, there was a little bit of deviation in the usage. So I would always compare them before I delete anything. But yeah, as I said, figure out which one you trust and then keep that. But try and make the switch at a year end rather than midway through the year. It's very difficult if you switch in July. And I would say this for any data source. If you switch in July, you've got 6 months of data in the old format and 6 months of data in the new format. That makes your year-end reporting more challenging than it needs to be.
Okay, thank you. I will just add to this that we have 2 more webinars, same time next week and the week after, always on Tuesday, 4 o'clock p.m. our time. So now, in 2 weeks, and in 2 weeks it will be me and my colleague Camilla talking exactly about this. We will be discussing what different approaches we have seen with our users, how we've dealt already with the transition. So maybe, Paul, you will get more answers in 2 weeks. So don't forget to also register for that one. I hope that is okay for you for now. And we can move on to another question.
Simona, there are 2 questions about why we stopped using the phrase sushi, which I think I can address very quickly.
Okay.
And it's because NISO asked us to. We way back in 2017 stopped using the old XML protocol that is actually defined by NISO's SUSHI standard. And we should have changed the terminology at that point, and they've asked us to do it now. So we did that. We also had a lot of people who were new to Counter who were like, why on earth are you talking about delicious Japanese food? What is this? So Counter API, while it is acknowledged as somewhat less interesting a name, it is more useful.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca here was asking the same thing, but at the end of her answer, there is her question. There is a little bit more. She's also asking if there is anything else on the horizon regarding national reporting, particularly in relation to ARL, or how libraries might begin submitting more standardized usage data. She would love to hear that.
I mean, I would love for ARL and other big national bodies to actually ask for my support and engagement. I have offered it repeatedly and getting nowhere fast. Sorry, that sounded very negative.
I will maybe just add that in CELUS we have some like specialized reports. This is what because I see I am still sharing my screen. Sorry for that. You have these specialized reports here where we already when we know about the national reporting requirements, we try to automate it as much as possible here in CELUS. So if the requirements is use this version of Counter, use this report and this metric, and sum it together with this report and this metric, then this is something that we can automate in CELUS. So if you have some specific national requirements for reporting, let us know, and we will try to prepare a special report in CELUS so that you can make your life easier and just get the data here very quickly.
Perfect. Thank you, Beda. Many of us are pulling stats for July 2024 to June 2025. Will we get our full numbers if we select counter 5.1? Or do we have to break up the report and select counter 5 for July to December and counter 5.1 for January to June?
Well, Beda showed you that you can get everything in one hit in CELUS. But for those of you who are still doing this manually, it slightly depends on the publisher. Very few publishers have gone back and reprocessed their older data. So you would have to request the 5 report for July to December and then 5.1 for January to June. If they've reprocessed, you can get 5.1 for everything. If they're still offering 5, you can use 5 for everything. But it is a publisher by publisher piece. We did not require reprocessing of old data, only the implementation in January.
Thank you, Tasha. We have another upvoted question from Olivia. I've heard about how new AI-mediated discovery tools retrieve or summarize content in ways that don't produce traditional counter events. How are CELUS and Counter thinking about identifying or contextualizing this kind of AI-driven access?
Well, as I mentioned, we have a consultation coming out in a couple of weeks. We have spent, 6 months now, Beda, trying to put together a framework for reporting AI usage that takes as many factors as possible into account. It's a challenge because anything that we do now, we don't want it to be outdated in 6 months' time. So it's something that's quite difficult to do. What I will do is pop into the chat a link to the last blog post that we did on the topic of generative and agentic AI. So you can see where we were at the point. So Simona, if you don't mind sharing that more broadly, would be great.
Sure, absolutely. I see 2 upvotes on a question from Mavis. I found that CELUS usage statistic tool is offered with a 30-day free trial, which means libraries need to pay for these functions after trial. Is there any better way to use Alma or Excel functions to manage counter?
I think Gail has actually already answered that in the Q&A box. She said it's not a question, but folks who are asking what the deal is with CELUS, is it worth it? She says, in my experience, yes, it's very much worth the cost. We use it at Smith College and it's made our lives so much easier. We're able to do a lot more real resource and subscription assessment now that we're spending less time on manual harvesting. So there you go. One of our lovely attendees has answered a question before we got to it.
Okay, thank you, Tasha, and also thank you, Gail. And I promise you that we did not pay Gail before this webinar to say that. One quite easy question from Andreas. If on the platform we have more than one institution, can we see institutions separately on CELUS? Beda, can you take this one?
Yes, I was just trying to find my unmute button. Sorry for that. Yes, definitely. You can in CELUS reporting, you can split your data in any way you want by institution and so on. And any way you do it, it will still do this merging of the reports in the background. So if, for instance, for one institution you have only counter 5 data, for the other you have it mixed, it will always mix it the way you want it. So it will use the primary report wherever possible and then fill in the data from the fallback report, even for each institution separately and so on. So that there is no limitation there. I would also like to answer another question which was there and disappeared, and that was about non-counter usage. Because I mentioned that we are using this interest for comparing counter and non-counter usage. We have like 4 different types of interest which we recognize. It's full text, search, multimedia, and then other. And when we get some non-counter reports, we always try to map them to one of these categories. So is it full text, is it multimedia? If there are more metrics, which of them would be the most, the one best corresponding to counter? But of course, it's always, it's not a perfect match. Usually with the non-counter reports, you have no guarantee that the data was obtained in some like manner that is really like clear and what it really means exactly and so on. But at least you have some kind of comparison. So if you get, I don't know, 100 PDF downloads from one platform, and then you have some counter data, another, and it's 200, I don't know, total item requests or whatever, you can somehow compare it. You can see it side by side and have some like more like a guidance which one of them is maybe gets more usage also. But whenever possible, use counter. It's much more higher quality data because the platforms are audited, so you are guaranteed that they are counting the usage really the way it should be.
Yes, just to add to this, CELUS can currently process over 150 non-counter platforms, and we have seen lots and lots of usage data, which is really, really messy. So yeah, I agree completely with what Beda just said. Okay, one more question from Rebecca. We are in the middle of tagging all of our resources in CELUS, including textbooks, for reporting and analysis. One question that has come up for us is how to tag an account for open access resources that we do not pay for. Is there recommended guidance for proactively tagging OA platforms or titles in CELUS so we can separate licensed usage from open access usage in our reporting? Beda looks slightly overwhelmed, but I believe he knows the answer.
I am not sure. Well, in CELUS there is already a built-in tag for open access, which we like where we tag specific titles from like external resources, like the DOAJ, where we get the list of open access journals and then we tag them directly in CELUS, so you don't have to do that. But if you have your own lists or something, then I'm not. I don't have any specific recommendations. Just that you can upload these lists in the CELUS, and definitely what I would recommend is turn on this periodic retagging. So whenever new data arrives into CELUS, it will be retagged so that newly coming titles will also get these tags. And yeah, that's it. But have a look at the DOAJ tags that are already present in CELUS. That those might be useful.
The DOAB tags, I don't know if you have DOAB tags available, but that might be another thing
as well
to look at.
DOAJ and DOAB.
And of course, you always have access type open, so you can see the stuff that is open access, whether or not you've funded it.
Perfect.
Yes, I think in this it's maybe slightly better in 5.1
Yeah,
than
I think so.
it used to be in 5.
Great, great, awesome. Okay, one more additional question from Caleb. Just to be clear, again, non-CELUS user here. If I have data from January to July in R5 and August to December in R5.1, are they exactly comparable? For example, total item requests is the same across both releases. I can just combine those numbers.
Yes, in as much as we did not change any of the way that data has to be processed, but with the caveat that I've already given you about books. So we did, like, books are now treated as at chapter level rather than aggregate level. So that, apart from that single book type, everything else is the exact same as it used to be. So 5 to 5.1, you can compare like with like. You will have more granular information about access types, but if you aggregate everything, ignoring the access types, it's exactly the same.
Okay, I hope that answers that question.
I will maybe add that with the new data types, some of the usage may have like changed the data type from one release to the other. So if you have filters in your reports, like saying I only want, let's say, newspaper and newsletter or something like that. And now it maybe has like split into two separate data types in Counter 5.1. You may have to review your filters in the reports.
Less likely with newspapers and newsletters, but certainly conferences.
Yeah.
When we spoke to publishers, it was almost a 50-50 split about which publishers had bundled their conferences into journals and which publishers had bundled their conferences into books. Now they are its own separate data type, so that is something you will need to look at. There is one of the friendly guides on the Counter website is changes from 5 to 5.1, and that might be helpful. I'm really sorry. I have another meeting in 5 minutes, so I am going to have to say goodbye.
Thank you so much, Tasha. It was great as usual, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
I will definitely see you all soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Tasha.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, so I guess we can answer them before we all leave. Mary is asking, I'm working on ACRL reporting, and for certain providers, I've harvested Counter 5 usage for fiscal year 25. However, the provider has since stopped providing R5. And my practice for ACRL reporting is to check the harvested number against the manually pulled number. What would you do in this case? Switch to R5.1 for fiscal year 25 for this vendor?
If I understand it, maybe it's fiscal year 2025. I am not sure where it ends. I think definitely trying 5.1 data and comparing it might be an option. It will simply give you some extra information, but it might, if the fiscal year started in July last year, then you might not be able to get the 5.1 usage for last year. So yeah, it really depends on which vendor it is and if they have the data in 5.1 completely or if they have just part of it. It really depends.
Thank you, Beda. Athena Hebner here is chiming in here with, you will need to harvest part of the year in 5 and the remainder in 5.1. So that's a little bit from Athena, who will be speaking next week in another webinar about how they in the University of Central Florida are dealing with the transition. So guys, make sure that you are registered for that one as well, and you will learn some more. Okay, so that was Betty, and we have the last question from Rebecca before we let you all go. For those of us working in a multi-campus or multi-library system, does each individual library need its own subscription to CELUS, or can one CELUS subscription cover the entire consortium? If a single subscription can support multiple institutions, how does CELUS recommend structuring campuses, branches, or reporting units so the data remains clean and separable for iPad reporting?
I think I can try to answer this one. Yes, we can. Of course, well, it all depends on what data you have, because sometimes we encountered the situation before that there was a university which has several campuses, but they had only one SUSHI credential, so they were downloading only one set of data, and within counter data there was no differentiation. That there is no differentiation between organizations or campuses. So in that case, we cannot attribute usage to campus A, B, or C. So it will be all under one umbrella. But if you have different subscriptions and the different credentials, then we can distinguish the usage. And in this case, the best setup would be kind of like a consortium setup we can do as well. So then you will have an overview of usage either for the whole consortium or for your individual members. But that's of course there can be one subscription, and it's not in a way that every organization needs to pay the full list price. For consortia we have a different pricing, but it's always individual depending on their needs and the technical setup they require. So Rebecca, we can probably take it offline and afterwards if you reach out to us, we can schedule a call with you and decide how will it work best for you in the OK state.
Okay, that's all the questions we had. So thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope we will see you also next week and the week afterwards. And for everyone who's now thinking about joining CELUS, please notice that we have a free trial and you can just start it right now. You can just go to celus.net and you can start your free trial and you can get your hands or everything that you have seen today and everything else. And if you have any questions, please let us know at ask@celus.net.